Welcome everybody. We are here with Robby Ferguson, the CEO of Animoca.
Hi, how are you?
Fine, thank you. We are barefoot. That's very interesting fact because that's the first barefoot interview for Robby and for me as well. That's also the sign that we stay humble even though that we are in the bull market.
Yes.
And speaking of being humble, what do you think? Where we are in the bull market and whether it's even important to you?
Sure. So I think now that we look back in hindsight, we can see that I think the market kind of turned in Q4 last year.
Okay.
Probably triggered by the fake news from Cointelegraph about Bitcoin ETFs, and now so we're a solid 1 quarter into the market. I think we were debating internally, and of course with friends in the industry, how long this cycle will last.
Yeah.
I'm quite confident in the rest of this year and feeling more confident about quite a bit of next year as well. I'm optimistic for that. I don't think it's something that makes us really change the way that we do business,
Of course.
but it makes everything we do so much easier because positive market sentiment drives everything else. So
Okay.
for our industry, the key metric ends up being the price of Bitcoin because that's our macroeconomic indicator.
Of course.
So instead of, inflation or employment numbers or something like that, for us, the price of Bitcoin, when it goes up, it makes everything we do easier because it makes people feel positive about what's going on in Web3, even though it's actually not, we don't really do much with Bitcoin as a company, for
Oh, yes.
example, but it has an impact on us. So it
course.
helps us to raise money for our portfolio companies, but also it helps with players because players are out there spending more money in games when they feel positive about the environment.
And I'm really curious because you are invested in so many companies. What is the number of your portfolio companies right now?
I don't know, but
It's more than
a little-
500?
A little over 500. Yeah, I
Yeah,
believe.
that's what I heard.
Yeah.
So I'm very curious because their stage of development is very different. So
Yes.
some of them may be not mature enough to do their listing during the bull market, but sometimes it's worth it to capitalize and do the good ROI. So I'm really curious, what's your strategy? Do you push the projects to do listing during this bull market, or it doesn't matter for you? If it's needed, you can wait for
Sure.
the next market cycle, or maybe it's good to list during the bear market.
Sure.
So I'm really curious whether the market conditions are impacting
Sure.
the go-to-market strategy.
So I think what happens is first you shouldn't ever list a token if it's not necessary or it's not time.
Yeah.
But a good market window opportunity does impact how you think about listing a token. So for example, if you have a project that already had a plan to launch a token, say this year or early next year, then we say to them, look, the window is good, hurry up, right?
Okay.
And build the product and develop the product and get users more excited. So if they were thinking maybe I will launch in July and then we will think about our token at the end of the year, we say, no, come on, launch the product sooner and get traction because you can take advantage of the market opportunity, but you still need the product to be ready.
Of course. But one of the very good tools of the user acquisition is definitely the airdrop mechanism. I'm really curious, what do you think about the airdrops? Because
Sure.
my take on that, as we spoke before, is that like a lot of projects are relying on an endless airdrop distribution. So what do you think is the middle ground here?
I think it's a fantastic mechanism, but like any tool, you need to know how to use the tool properly. And I think you can, use it for positive impact, but you have to really always think through very carefully how you're not just onboarding the users in the game, but what kind of users you're bringing on board.
Yeah.
And so the airdrop mechanic can be used based on all different parameters. How frequently you airdrop, how much you airdrop, what kind of things you airdrop. Do they have value? Do they have monetary value or only playable value? And each of these changes to these parameters will affect the kind of users you attract. So you have to think about how you want to compose your audience because, of course, like any economy, you want to have balance between different types of people and different types of players.
The market conditions are also very important because the airdrop campaign is much more effective during the bull market, but also you need to make a very wise decision how to target this audience. So I think that's a very important point from what you said, that we need to not only distribute airdrop, but also trying to figure it out what kind of users are we onboarding.
Yes.
within this process. Speaking of the recent trends, there is no doubt that AI become a very important part of our industry. This is the trend. So I'm really curious whether do you see the ways of implementing AI into the Web3 gaming? Or...
Yes. So I think it's in the short term, we've found that it's quite useful for our game development process.
Okay.
So in our game development process, we tend to use AI in a couple of ways. Obviously, generative art is very useful for doing primarily 2D graphics is really where it's best, but you can use it for 3D visualizations.
By the way, did you find any tool which is able to generate 3D models with the AI prompts, or is it
Sure.
the current stage of development in passing?
So this is where I give a plug for one of our portfolio companies.
Okay, so we already
Labs. Yes. And what they do is they can basically take a text prompt and go from a text prompt to a full 360-degree virtual environment, which you can then export wireframe models into 3D software.
That's super cool.
And the part that is the time saver is actually the ideation, because traditionally, when we would sit around and try to figure out how to make a game, the designers would say, oh, well, you know, we want it to be aliens in space and battleships and 3 planets, and then somebody would say, okay, so go draw it. And they would draw storyboards and come back 3 days later. And then they'd say, no, it's not a good idea. Now you can literally type that in, boom, you generate it. And then they tell you in 30 seconds, it's not a good idea.
And that's a super perfect use case. So, for example, in Star Heroes, one of our portfolio companies, I had a dream because I'm a big fan of Rolls-Royce. So I wanted to have the spaceship, which is a little bit similar to Rolls-Royce. So having this AI tool, probably we could create a prompt that create a spaceship which is inspired by, which is having the Rolls-Royce vibe, and that's it. But I'm really curious because, as far as I understand how AI works, you need to rely on some data. For example, the way how Midjourney is working, that they are aggregating a lot of data around 2D pictures.
Yes.
They combine it and create like the final effect. So this project which you mentioned, how do they source those 3D models, and how do they make the final effect?
Sure. So they typically work with a lot of the other Gen AI models out there.
Okay. So they created the base, right?
Yes. And so they create, but I think what they did was they essentially customized the way the generative AI model works for the purpose of game development specifically.
Okay.
So rather than just for making 3D images or 2D images, they focused on how do we make the job of a game designer easier. And so that makes that, I mean, other people have done it, but there are not many teams I've seen in AI who just focused on this particular sort of B2B application for gaming.
I'm really close to this topic because one of our portfolio companies, which is Jungle Art, created the NFT marketplace for 3D models from the Web3 gaming. So because the long-term goal is to create the biggest user base, like for example, there is a Unity store, you know, so that's the place, but you need to pay for every single one. Imagine building this in the decentralized way, because even across your portfolio companies, there are like hundreds of or thousands or hundreds of thousands items, 3D items, and the creators are not earning on them. So imagine having the marketplace for this. Once you have this a big base, then you can implement this AI model and within the prompts create the final effect. So I think we can even join forces with this.
Sounds good.
Anyway, I'm also really curious because you are 11 years old. Like you are not 11 years old, but it's already 11 years since you are into the Web3. So what did you bring here to the Web3? What was the reason why you pivoted? Because I think that was a very important decision for your life.
Okay. So, you know, I started my game journey, as you said, over a decade ago, and we were focused mainly on free-to-play mobile games at the time. And I think one of the things that happened to us, you know, about around 2015, 2016, was the business started to slow down because obviously a lot of the growth drivers in the mobile industry were as a result of new handset activations. Not everybody had a smartphone, but by 2018 or 2019, pretty much everybody had the smartphone, right? And so new activations as a vector for installations of new games slowed down. So the cost of user acquisition became very expensive. And for us, we felt this acutely back in 2015 and 16 because we were a medium-sized game company.
Okay.
Bigger game companies didn't feel this yet because they have a lot of organic distribution. And this problem has only gotten worse. So we were always looking for new technologies that would help us to solve this problem of user acquisition and how do we keep ourselves growing in the game industry. And so in 2017, we discovered blockchain, like many people, by accident, right? And so we found some friends who were working on a hackathon project, and the idea behind their project was to tokenize content inside a game so that it could be unique, because before that there were only fungible tokens. So they created the NFT standards, which we know in the industry as ERC 721. And that team became Dapper Labs. And so they created for the game CryptoKitties, which we worked on together with them as the publisher in Greater China. And so that was our first experience with a game that involved tokens. And we very quickly decided that that was how we wanted to make games in the future, because it finally fulfilled this promise of actually giving property rights over digital in-game items to players, which before we sold them lots of stuff in our Web2 games, but they didn't actually own it. So this was our opportunity to make things that they could actually own.
And another thing which you pointed is that Web3 is also the tool which could decrease the cost per user acquisition, because I think that's the problem that you figured out in the 2015, that this cost is increasing. The centralized entities are like having monopoly around this industry. So introducing blockchain to the gaming is a new opportunity to onboard a new wave of gaming titles. So I think that was...
For sure. Well, because once you involve like a token economy, essentially you allow the benefits of the network effects of those games to be shared amongst all the participants in the game. It's not just that it accrues to the maker of the game and the investors, but the players also have a stake in the network. And so that equitable distribution actually, I think, acts as a great retention mechanism in games.
Another question that I have is, I'm really curious, what are the elements of the Web3 gaming that you are mostly bullish about? If you can shape the future and imagine the future of Web3 gaming, some people says that it is esport. Some people says that maybe Web3 gaming is only for gaming investors who combine playing and investing, that it can become like a new genre. So I'm really curious, what's your take on that?
Sure. I think that for me, the most exciting thing about Web3 gaming is the idea that we essentially are creating games with open source technology. Because the idea that we can start to have games where we share resources, we interoperate content, we interoperate value is really exciting, because it allows us to build a much more interconnected ecosystem. But I think the biggest barrier to that in the short term is distribution. And the biggest avenue of distribution is mobile. So I think one of the things that will have the biggest impact on our industry is if we see more of an embracing of Web3 infrastructure and mechanics from Apple and Google. Because they have the power of huge distribution on mobile, which, as hard as we try on web or console and PC, it's not the same as mobile.
And when you mean distribution, you mean like the centralized platforms like Apple Store or...
Yes, but also because so many people, like of the world of gamers, the majority play on mobile. So if we don't have mobile in our arsenal, we're targeting a much smaller audience.
Oh yeah, that's true. And do you see any potential to create like some competitor for Google or Apple Store, or we need to rely on those centralized entities and within them create something new?
I'm not sure. It's interesting. There is potential with like PWA, where you can essentially create a web-based, like HTML5 based application that loads onto a phone. Within the Web3 community, we've seen examples of this with things like FriendTech, for example, which was a particularly like crypto native product. But the thing I found interesting was the distribution mechanic was direct to consumer as opposed to through the App Store. And they achieved a certain amount of scale. right? And so it's nice to see that that is possible. But so far, most of the successful games that incorporate Web3 mechanics on mobile still go through the app stores. You know, things like Upland or Cross the Ages, for example. These all go through the traditional app stores.
Yes, like Mafia as well. They have like 3 million downloads. So, so if I get you right, like you pointed out that you are a big fan, big enthusiast of decentralized content creators. So, how do you imagine this? That gamers will be able to create like in-game items and upload this within the game. How do you see this decentralization of game creation?
So the funny thing about the game industry is that we have lots of game developers who have incredibly, brilliant ideas, and they make all kinds of very creative games. But often, the games that the players like the most are what we call mods in the industry, which are essentially games that are based on modifications of other famous games made by the users. Because exactly, because it's about fans, right? And often the biggest fans also happen to know how to create content as well.
Right.
And so it would be great if we could have more tools that allow for that type of spontaneous creation of content by fans.
Okay.
It's one of the reasons why one of our bigger projects in the space is called the Sandbox, which is a UGC metaverse where it's all about user-generated content, because we really think Web3 does a great job of providing the financial and content infrastructure for empowering creators.
Now I understand. I believe that's it's having a big potential, and I think that that's a good way for Web3 gaming to develop. However, I think that another sector which might be very interesting is definitely the esports. Right now, there is not a single Web3 gaming title which reached the mainstream adoption. And when we think about mainstream adoption, it is usually connected with esports streamers and stuff like that. Do you see potential also in this regard?
Yes, definitely.
And do you think, what is the advantage of Web3 within the esports? What is the added value that you can add on it?
So I think the first thing maybe I'll comment on is an advantage that Web3 has generally, which is because of the powerful and low-cost infrastructure, it allows us to create games and products that cater to much smaller audiences, but that can monetize well enough for the developer to be able to support it. Because the problem in traditional gaming is that your platform fees and your user acquisition costs are all so high. You need to have a game of a certain scale just to be able to pay your staff, to make money as a game company. And it's very hard. And when we can cut down a lot of that expense and give that expense back to the developer to support development, we find with our Web3 games that monetize much higher, we can have audiences of hundreds of thousands or millions of players and sustainably support a studio, rather than having a game that has to have tens of millions or hundreds of millions of players because the monetization is so low. So I think you'll see a lot of products proliferating that are more niche and more focused on a very engaged fan base.
Okay.
But because the revenue model allows developers to support it, we will see lots more of these games.
Okay, that makes sense. And since there are a lot of developers also from the Web 2 considering pivoting into the Web 3, could you tell the future projects? Because maybe someone listening to us will become one of your portfolio companies. So
yes,
what are the aspects that you're analyzing within your due diligence in Animoca? What is the most important for you when you invest?
So I think it's not dissimilar to any other venture investor, right? We always think about team, we think about the product, we think about the addressable market, all of the basics that everybody knows. Yes. I think where we are uniquely situated in this transition from Web 2 to Web 3 is there is very much a mindset shift that happens when you start to embrace a new paradigm of how to make a product. And the easiest analogy is you look at the transition from games on the web or PC to games on mobile. And that transition from a large screen to a smaller screen was very difficult for a lot of game companies. Many game companies stayed out for a long time because they said, well, nobody wants to play a serious game on this little screen, right? And you remember all those early games, they tried to have a joystick on the screen.
Yes.
It didn't work because the joystick was from an old platform and the new platform needed to use swiping.
Yes.
So that's why Angry Birds was the first successful game, because they incorporated a native mechanic into the platform. And so when we think about Web3, we have to ask ourselves, what are these native mechanics that make Web3 different from Web2, that really show off why this is a very powerful new medium? And that's why I also think that the innovators and the leaders in this space are going to be the Web3 native companies who understand how to fully utilize all those tools.
Okay, that's my perfect sense. Robby, it was an honor for me to have this interview with you.
Thank you.
And
Great to have a chat.
Exactly.
Appreciate it.
And for our viewers, we are recommending to follow Robby Ferguson and the Animoca Brands. They are doing a great job within Web3 gaming. And let's keep in touch. Maybe in the future we'll have another conversation with Robby. Thank you and stay tuned.
Thank you.